I'd like to thank Ann Chin for inviting me to talk about my research on the history of Africans in North America, as the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project prepares to mark 495 years of the mainland's transatlantic human trade. This month, they'll place a marker at Darien, Georgia, near the supposed site of San Miguel de Gualdape, Spain's first attempt at a permanent settlement in North America. As many have noted, the 1619 project, significant as it was, begins African history in North America when, quote, 20 and odd Negroes, pirated from a private slavers, the Portuguese ship São João Bautista, were sold to colonists at Jamestown. This may be the first beginning of the English slave system in North America, but Africans, free and enslaved, were here more than a century earlier. And the patterns of African life in the Spanish Americas had their institutional and customary origins in medieval Spain. Africans began to form a very growing sector of the southern populations of Spain from the 13th century onward. By the 16th century, so many Africans lived in the southern parts of Spain that one scholar compared early modern Seville to a chessboard. Spanish law considered freedom the natural state of man, and slavery was a legal condition that was neither race-based nor perpetual. The enslaved could be freed by their owner, by the state, or even by self-purchase. And in Sevilla, free and enslaved Africans worked as stevedores or in the city's public granaries. They built ships, they worked in slaughterhouses, gardens, and soap factories. They transported people and goods throughout the city. They were artisans and petty merchants in the commercial districts and domestic servants in Spanish households. Though usually members of the lower classes and excluded from some Spanish guilds, free Africans and their descendants enjoyed the status of registered citizens or vecinos. They established religious brotherhoods and participated in the numerous religious festivals of the Catholic calendar. And in the multiracial and multi-ethnic barrios of Seville, miscegenation and common law unions between Spaniards and Africans were common, and the lower classes entered into mixed-race official marriages with apparently little stigma. Given their numbers and roles in Spanish port cities like Seville, it's not surprising that both free and enslaved Africans hoped to improve their lots by crossing the Atlantic on the earliest voyages of exploration and conquest. With the Spaniards, they soon formed a specialized and limited pool of human resources circulating throughout the Circum-Caribbean. Africans and Europeans on these expeditions faced extraordinary hardships and life-altering events, but they also created a new Creole society in the Americas. The first African to explore North America was Juan Garrido, a man of unknown West African origins. Garrido traveled first to Lisbon, Portugal, sometime in the 1490s, and then went on to Seville, where he sailed later for Hispaniola. There Garrido encountered other free blacks, such as Juan González Ponce de León, an interpreter of the Taíno language, who had adopted his surname from his Spanish patron. The two African adventurers took part in the, quote, pacification campaigns against the native populations who were in revolt in Hispaniola, which is modern-day Dominican Republic and Haiti. These people may have well faced other Africans in the battle because Governor Nicolás de Ovanda complained as early as 1503 that some of the island's first African slaves had already run away, thereafter being known as cimarrones, or in English you would say maroons, and that they had found refuge among the Indian rebels. The alliance on that island of revolting Indians and fugitive slaves haunted the Spaniards, who were in the minority in Hispaniola and only tenuously held power. Despite these fears, however, Spaniards came to regard African slaves as indispensable to successful colonization of the Americas. In 1505, the Spanish crown sent an unstated number of, quote, Guinea-born slaves to labor in Hispaniola's copper mines, and in 1510, King Ferdinand authorized the shipment of several hundred more Christian and Spanish-speaking African slaves, denominated Ladinos, from Sevilla for sale to the island settlers. Still, the settlers demanded more, and in 1513 the Crown established a permanent contract system licensing contractors through the Crown to send, quote, Guinea-born slaves to the island of Hispaniola and on other islands as well. We're guessing that between 75,000 and 90,000 enslaved Africans went to Spanish America by 1600, and approximately 350,000 by the end of the 17th century. And because contraband trade in slaves was endemic, those are probably conservative figures. Once the Indian Wars on Hispaniola waned and settlement was underway, it became the base from which Spaniards launched new conquests, claiming Puerto Rico in 1508, Jamaica in 1509, Cuba in 1511, and La Florida in 1513. And Africans Juan Garrido and Juan Gonzalez joined the expeditions to explore and conquer Puerto Rico, where they settled down briefly to become gold miners. Although Queen Isabella had forbidden the enslavement of her new Indian subjects, the alleged ferocity of the people that came to be reputed cannibals led her to authorize just war, as they called it, against hostile indigenous groups. And soon Spaniards were sweeping through the Caribbean islands and the mainland coast of North America in search of indigenous captives to sell into slavery. From Puerto Rico, Juan Ponce de Leon led slave raids against the alleged cannibals on the islands of Santa Cruz, Guadalupe, and Dominica, and the Africans Juan Garrido and Juan Ponce de Leon were among the raiders. They also accompanied Ponce de Leon on his voyages to Florida in 1513 and 1521, where the hostile reception of the local Indians suggests that those Caribbean-based slavers had already preceded Ponce de Leon, Juan Garrido, and Juan Ponce de Leon. Africans thus helped stake Spain's first claim to the sovereignty over an area, La Florida, that they said stretched from the Florida Keys to Newfoundland and west to the mines of Mexico. Neither the French nor the English accepted that, and they viewed effective occupation as the only true measure of sovereignty on the land. So to hold La Florida, the Spaniards would have to populate it, and Hispanola's royal judge, sugar planter, and slave trader of indigenous people, Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón, traveled to Spain in 1521 to seek a royal license to establish what would be Spain's first permanent settlement in North America. While he was in Spain, on Christmas Day of 1521, as he was being inducted into a prestigious military order of Santiago, 20 allegedly, quote, bellicose and perverse, Wolof-speaking slaves launched the first recorded slave revolt in the Americas in Hispaniola. The rebellion began on La Isabela, the sugar estate owned by Diego Colon, who was the son and heir of Christopher Columbus. But the rebels had actually organized a regional revolt and enlisted slaves from the sugar plantations all along the southern coast, where Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón owned the Santa Ana sugar estate. A primary source on this early slave revolt in the Spanish world is the Spanish chronicler González Fernández de Oviedo y Valdés, who lived in Hispaniola from 1514 to 1519, and again from 1533 to 1557. He wrote a massive Historia General y Natural de las Indias, and wrote that he learned the details of the first slave revolt from Governor Diego Colon himself and from other gentlemen and important men. Governor Diego Colon ordered swift punishment for any of these slaves captured, and Oviedo reported that the roadsides of Hispaniola were soon, quote, planted with the gallows and the hanged. So 4 years after the first known African slave rebellion was crushed, Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón attempted to establish a North American settlement at a site he called San Miguel de Gualdape. The settlement lasted only about 6 weeks and left a sparse documentary and cartographic trail. But archivally sound and expert historians, such as Paul Hoffman, believe it was located somewhere near Sapelo Sound, below South Carolina and close to Georgia. Ayllón's expedition was said to include some 600 Spanish men, women, and children, as well as the first known African slaves brought to the United States, the present-day United States. These enslaved persons merit only a very sparse reference in most accounts, with no details given of their ethnic origins, names, genders, or ages, nor how many were brought. Hoffman theorizes, and others also, that the Africans were few in number and that they must have been enslaved artisans and domestics of some of the more wealthy settlers of San Miguel. But it would seem more logical that Ayllón would have taken strong men with him to clear the land, build the structures, the houses, and a church that were built there, and to begin planting subsistence food crops in this new landscape, just as they did later when they established St. Augustine, Florida, and a failed colony at Santa Elena. Ayllón's new colony settlement of San Miguel was a disaster from the beginning. His largest ship, the Capitana, carried most of the food supplies and animals needed to survive, but it wrecked on a reef offshore, and although no lives were lost, all of the really important supplies were. Thereafter, an unknown disease and starvation killed many of the Spanish settlers, including Ayllón, and soon the Wale Indians of the location killed even more Spaniards who had imposed themselves on their nearby village, demanding their food. After that, dissension among the Spaniards and a mutiny among these desperate people followed, and then, to top it off, an extreme cold front further weakened the few survivors. And in the midst of the chaos, some of the unnamed enslaved Africans rose in rebellion. Again, documentation is sparse, and no one has yet considered the politics of these African rebels, but I might offer a few suggestions based on my research on other African rebellions in the Spanish world. As historians David Wheat, Mark Eagle, and others have documented, the earliest shipments of Africans to the Caribbean came from Senegambia, modern-day Senegal. This broad region was home to a variety of ethnic groups, but the Wolofs who led the 1521 revolt in Hispaniola on the Columbus estate were the most feared because they had allegedly been converted to Islam. The Spanish crown repeatedly banned their further introduction, not on the basis of their race, but on their Islamic religion. So it seems doubtful that Ayllón would have taken any Wolofs to the new colony. Still, despite the revolt, Hispaniola settlers had continued to demand more Africans to labor on their cattle ranches and sugar mills. And so we can look to inventories of the 1530s and 1540s from those estates, which show that Mandinga, Serir, Sape, Bran, and other Upper Guinean people formed the bulk of those workforces. The smallest estates held 70 people, 70 enslaved Africans. Most held between 100 and 200, and one even larger one held 700 enslaved people on one estate. There were also indigenous workers there in very small numbers, and the smallest number of all were the Spaniards who lived there. So it would seem likely that the Africans Ayllón took to San Miguel de Gualdape would have been from these Upper Guinean groups, and that some of them would have already lived among Spaniards on Hispaniola for some time, perhaps learning Spanish already. All Spanish accounts report that the Spanish mutineer that rose when things got bad at San Miguel de Gualdape, his name was Ginés Doncel, he arrested Ayllón's successor after Ayllón died, Captain Francisco Gomez, and his supporters. Well, the African slaves took sides in that dissension and in that mutiny, and they set fire to Doncel's house. Were the African rebels just destroying the settlement of their enslavers, or were they trying to free Gomez and his men? Reports say that after they set fires, the African rebels fled to live among the Wale Indians, who had killed those demanding Spaniards. Having been in the region less than 2 months, the Africans would probably not yet have been able to communicate with the indigenous people in their own language. But there's at least the possibility that they received assistance from an interesting native figure in this story. In 1521, as those African Wolofs were rebelling in Hispaniola, slave raiders commissioned by Ayllón captured an indigenous man near the Pedee River in South Carolina. This man became part of Ayllón's household, learned Spanish, and was baptized in the Catholic Church and given the name Francisco Chicorano. When Ayllón was back in Spain looking for a license to settle San Miguel de Gualdape, he took Francisco with him, and he presented him at the court of King Charles I. Francisco told fantastical tales of his homeland and helped Ayllón win a license to settle the region. But almost as soon as Francisco set foot in his homeland, he stripped off his Spanish clothing, and one might say his Spanish veneer, and fled inland. Might Francisco have helped and welcomed the African rebels who fled inland? We might never know for sure, since they all disappeared from history. But many of their marooned counterparts were already blending into indigenous communities in Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Cuba, and Mexico. Perhaps archaeology or genetic science will one day offer us more clues about what happened to those Africans. Meanwhile, I will continue to search for them in the Spanish archives. Thank you.